Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed lead one of the NFL's best group of cornerbacks. However, offensive line is a concern for the Jets, while tight end is a bit of a wild card. We're going to rank the positions on the Jets roster ahead here on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, May 25th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so that you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give this show a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up if you enjoy the show. These things help us out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Yesterday we did our weekly mailbag show, and I got a very interesting question from one listener that I did not answer yesterday. The question went like this: what positions on the roster do you feel comfortable with? Which positions do you feel least comfortable with? And which positions have the biggest question marks? And I felt like that was such a good question that it was worthy of an entire show. And I think this is a good time of year to take stock of what the New York Jets have on their roster. We are past free agency for the most part. We're past the NFL draft. There might be a trade here or there. There might be a signing that's unexpected. But for the most part, we know what the roster is. So this is a good chance to take initial stock of what the Jets have as we wrap up the offseason program in the next couple of weeks and then turn our attention to training camp a little bit later in the summer. So let's begin by talking about the positions I feel comfortable with on this Jets roster. And I'm going to begin, and maybe it's not so much for depth, but just because of who's starting. And it's the most important position on the field, quarterback, Aaron Rodgers. You may have heard the Jets made a trade for him, future Hall of Fame quarterback, a guy you could make a pretty strong argument is one of the top 10 at his position in the history of pro football. It's nice to feel good about the quarterback position. And I think this year's Jets team is actually kind of an interesting experiment because there's always this debate, how much does the quarterback really matter? Everybody knows quarterback's the most important spot on the field, but how much does quarterback really make a difference? And the Jets give us a unique test case here because they got probably, if not the worst quarterback play in the NFL last year, close to it. And if you look at the rest of the roster, I don't think they really got much worse at any position. I don't think they really got much better at any other position. Really, quarterback is the one spot that there's a big difference in what the Jets will have starting there this year versus what they had last year, or at least what they planned to start last year. Of course, there were injuries, there were backups who had to take spots during the season, but I think that the quarterback's really the one spot where the Jets have made a significant move. I mean, they've made a couple additions here or there. There are certain spots where maybe they're a little bit better. There are certain spots where maybe they're a little bit worse than they were a year ago. But quarterback's the biggest position. And the Jets have gone from, again, maybe the worst quarterback play of the league last year when you combine what you got from Zach Wilson, Joe Flacco, and Mike White. If you want to throw in that game Chris Streveler played, maybe you can, even though Streveler, looked okay, I guess. Quarterback is now manned by Aaron Rodgers. And there's still a question of what you're going to get from Rodgers. I think at 39, asking for MVP level play is going to be a lot, and that's just because he's 39. There are, outside of Tom Brady, there really aren't 39-year-olds who play at an MVP level. But I think it's reasonable to think Rodgers is probably going to be like a top 8 type of quarterback, and that's an enormous upgrade. And on a roster where the Jets have talent at key spots, it's going to be interesting to see what Rodgers does and how much that impacts the team. Now, I'll go to the strongest position on the team, and that's cornerback. That's led by Sauce Gardner, first-team All-Pro last year. It's also anchored by DJ Reed, who's an excellent outside corner in his own right, a guy who would be number one corner on a lot of teams. And this duo gives the Jets a lot of flexibility on defense because it allows them to be more aggressive if they choose to blitz more frequently. Although Robert Saleh, I think, likes to just rush 4. But this is an excellent group of corners. You can even throw Michael Carter II in there, who's a good slot corner. And even beyond that, the depth, I think, is good because you have guys with starting experience and young guys in Brandon Echols and Bryce Hall. And although these guys may not be the greatest corners in the NFL, you do have guys who've got experience and guys who, if these are your number 4 and number 5 corners, I think you're pretty good. Now, if they're your 1 and 2 like they were back in 2021, you may have some issues at the corner position. But if these guys are your fourth and fifth and they're your backups, I think that's a pretty good spot to be in. Another spot where I think the Jets are very good right now is on the defensive line. They have that one anchor player, that one star guy, that one guy who really moves the needle in Quinnen Williams, a guy who you hope you can count on to be a double-digit sack guy. Now, I know last year was kind of his breakout year, so there's a question, is he going to regress? Is he going to maintain that level of play? But Quinnen Williams, is a very good player. My personal theory on Quinnen Williams is last year was his breakout year. It was the year he started to put it all together. I think if you're asking me what's going to happen, I think he's going to continue to be a great player. And after that, there's just a lot of quality players. There may not be another great player, but you've got Carl Lawson, you've got John Franklin Myers, who I think will probably play a bit more inside this year at tackle. You've got, Quentin Jefferson's okay. He's not a bad player, especially as a pass rusher, so you can throw him in the mix. We were talking about third downs, who could come in. And then you also have some good young depth players in Bryce Huff, a guy who really brought a lot of speed off the edge last year and had a pressure rate of around 20% in pass rushing situations. A couple guys the Jets drafted a year ago in Michael Clemens and Jermaine Johnson. This year's first-round pick, Will McDonald. So lots of early-round picks, lots of ability on this defensive line. Even Al Woods, a run stopper. Lots of guys who are good players. So defensive line and corner are I think, very solid. And then I'd also go back to the offensive side of the ball. The last position I'd say I think the Jets, I feel really comfortable with what the Jets have is wide receiver. And I won't lie, that's mostly Garrett Wilson. I mean, after Garrett Wilson, you have a lot of guys who are quality NFL players. Garrett Wilson's the star in the making in this group. 1,100 yards in one of the worst offenses in the NFL, a bad infrastructure a year ago. He really produced for this team. And then after him, you don't have great players. You've got Corey Davis, you've got Alan Lazard, you've got Mecole Hardman, you've got Randall Cobb. None of those guys is spectacular. None of them is really that great. But what you have in those, you have guys who are at least competent NFL receivers. And if you go back, years where the Jets were throwing guys like Jermaine Kearse out there, they were throwing like Rashard Matthews in Sam Darnold's rookie year. I mean, the Jets were, you could go back to Geno Smith's time with the Jets where they were giving David Nelson significant snaps. It's a big difference to have those type of guys behind a legitimate number one receiver in Garrett Wilson. Now, I'd love to see the Jets add to that group, but I think based on the strength of Garrett Wilson and then a little bit based on the depth behind the role players behind him, I think wide receiver is another position where you feel comfortable. I'm going to make one other point. So I've given you 4 positions where I feel really comfortable with what the Jets have, or at least comfortable to some degree. To me, on most teams, and it can vary based on the quality of your players. It can vary based on the quality of what your scheme requires. But of the positions in the NFL, I just named you 4 of what I think are the 5 most important positions. I named you quarterback, I named you corner, I named you defensive line, and I named you wide receiver. The only one I'm not including in this list among my top 5 is offensive line, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But I think the Jets are at least solid at 4 of these 5 spots. And that's one of the reasons I think that this is going to be a pretty good Jets team this year. If you look, FanDuel Sportsbook, our partner, has the Jets around 9.5 wins as an over-under. That seems to be a pretty common theme. You see a lot of 9.5 wins, and that's kind of where I'm at right now with the Jets. I think if you ask me right now, I think the Jets are probably around a 10-win team. And if a few things break their way injury-wise and luck-wise, they maybe win a little bit more. If a few things, they have some bad luck, maybe they win a little less. But I think it's around a 10-win team, and that's because I think in 4 of these 5 key spots, the Jets are in pretty good shape, and they have talent. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will turn our attention. So you can turn the show off now if all you wanted to hear was good things, because ahead we're going to tell you the positions where I have some concern. And one of the big 5 that I mentioned is among them, offensive line. You could talk yourself into it, but you have to be a little bit worried about this line, and I'll explain why in a little bit more detail as we continue this Thursday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs and the upcoming NBA Finals. The Denver Nuggets have already punched their ticket. It's probably going to be the Miami Heat that they're playing if the Heat can finish off the Boston Celtics. And no matter what the NBA Finals matchup is, you can go to FanDuel because right now new customers can get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. So if you're a big LeBron fan or if you're a local fan, you may not have a rooting interest in the NBA Finals, but there's no better bet on all the playoff action and the NBA Finals action than America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. Again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen every day. And everydayers, thank you so much for tuning in. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes Monday through Friday and then bonus episodes as needed. Today we're taking stock of the Jets. Which positions are the strongest? We've talked about that in our first segment. Now we're going to turn to positions that I have concerns about. And first among them is the offensive line. Of the big five I think are quarterback, cornerback, defensive line, and wide receiver. And then offensive line. I think four of them, I feel pretty good about what the Jets have. Offensive line is an area of concern for me. And in part, that's because the Jets do have a 39, soon-to-be 40-year-old quarterback in Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers has had a lot of success in his career on the move. He's been a mobile quarterback. Maybe not the greatest rushing threat in the league, but a guy who can extend plays, a guy who has thrown with pinpoint accuracy, impossible throws on the run. And over the last couple of years, I think you've seen that mobility decrease. And when the mobility goes down, blocking effectively up front matters more. Now, I think Rodgers still has the ability to move within the pocket. And we've seen Tom Brady be a quarterback without great mobility, but a guy who survived in the league as long as he did because he could move within the pocket. So that could help mitigate it to an extent. I know there's some theories out there that Rodgers' ability to draw offsides on a hard count slows down pass rushers, so maybe that helps your offensive line out a bit. And I'll say this about the offensive line. You can talk yourself into it because there's a pathway to success for this line. If Dwayne Brown holds up at 38, and if Mekhi Becton returns and plays up to that first-round billing, and if Laken Tomlinson shakes off a rough first season with the Jets and is more comfortable in year two, that's three ifs right there. And I think when you're at this time of year, it's easy to talk yourself into things. It's easy to look at the best case scenario. And the best case scenario is the offensive line could be good. And if I had like one of those ifs, if I just needed one thing that was kind of up in the air to go right, I'd feel good about it. I'd say, okay, that's a realistic path to success. But when you start needing 2-3 things to go right on a 5-man unit, that's where you have to get a little concerned, I think, because I don't think you can assume everything's going to go right out for this line. And I think it could have an impact, and I think beyond that, the run blocking is a bit of a concern for this unit. Now, I will say a couple positive things here. First of all, I do like some of the depth players the Jets brought in this year. I thought Wes Schweitzer was a good addition as an interior offensive lineman. I think Billy Turner's good as a number 3 tackle. So what you won't have, as long as you don't suffer a number of injuries, you won't have like this decimation where you're 2 injuries away from Connor McDermott starting at tackle. You don't want to go to backups. I'm not saying the line's going to be great if you have backups in there, but there's a difference between having a guy who could maybe hold the fort and give you a credible play versus throwing Connor McDermott out there. The other thing about the line is, here's a good if. If Joe Tippmann can step into the starting lineup right away, and I'm not going to count that yet because it's not a guarantee, but he was a second-round pick. And one thing about the NFL, they don't evaluate every position great, but guys who are drafted in like that 20 to 50 range at center, they're usually pretty good. And there's no guarantee any individual player will be good, but what it tells me is that teams know what to look for at center. And that's one of those like league-wide things where sometimes there's like a lot of groupthink in the NFL, and teams just evaluate a position completely wrong because nobody ever stops to think, are we getting this right? At center, it seems like they get it right because I've gone through the list of players. Almost all of them have been good centers who have been drafted between like the 20 and 50 range over the last decade or two. So if Tippmann can step into the starting lineup, and he can move people. I mean, he just throws people around out there when he locks onto them. Tippmann's got some issues with his hand placement. There's some things he got to work on, but I've said this before. I'll say it again. Issues with technique can be made up for if you're willing to be physical. If you have just the right attitude as an offensive lineman. So that's the type of thing that could raise the ceiling of the offensive line. And it's the type of thing that could help the Jets out. And another thing that could help the Jets out is Elijah Vera Tucker's versatility. He's a guy who showed, at least for a limited time, if not longer, he can hold up at the tackle position. So that gives the Jets a little bit extra on the offensive line. But there are questions about this line. And I think that that's an area where it's the number one concern that I have for this team right now. Because a bad offensive line can really set you back. And I'm not saying the Jets' offensive line is necessarily going to be bad, because as I laid out, there is a scenario where everything could go quite well. But there are a lot of ifs that need to go right for the Jets on the offensive line. And I think we need to discuss those. Now, on the defensive side of the ball, there are two other spots where I have concerns. Linebacker and safety. And they're kind of, I don't know that they're interchangeable, because you never play a linebacker in the deep middle part of the field. But there's spots who play similar roles. They kind of cover the tight ends and the running backs in pass protection. They have to come up and play the run. You hope that your defensive line keeps them clean. You hope that these guys kind of play in the middle of the field. I've got concerns in both spots, and people will disagree because they say, well, we have these players. They have C.J. Mosley, who was a second-team All-Pro and a Pro Bowler last year, and to me, that was earned on reputation. I think Mosley plays the run pretty well still. I don't think he's a great fit for the scheme. I think that you want a linebacker who can cover a lot more ground than Mosley can. I don't think Mosley can really cover at this point of his career. He was never a great cover guy. I don't think he was bad last year. I think he's still an effective guy at filling the gaps. I think he's an effective guy playing the run. But I don't think he's a great fit for the scheme. And I think that those accolades last year, a lot of them were based on reputation. And next to him is Quincy Williams. And Quincy Williams is like, in baseball, he's like the home run hitter who strikes out a ton. Because when Quincy Williams makes a play, you see Quincy Williams make a play. You notice it. Quincy Williams also misses a lot. He whiffs on tackles sometimes. The biggest issue with him, he's just over-aggressive. He overruns plays at times. He fills the wrong gap too frequently. And then behind Quincy Williams, you got a lot of question marks. You got guys who could potentially step up, a Jamian Sherwood or a Zaire Barnes, but I think linebacker's an issue in part because I don't know that there's great coverage guys there. And then at the safety position, I like the addition of Chuck Clark. I think outside of quarterback, safety is probably the spot where the Jets have improved the most by putting Chuck Clark in over LaMarcus Joyner. But I don't think it makes that big of a difference. I think he and Jordan Whitehead are kind of interchangeable guys. They're both guys who are better at what people think of as the strong safety role, where you're playing close to the line, you're playing the run. I don't think either of them are particularly adept in coverage. So if you're looking at where the concerns are on the defensive side of the ball, it's kind of like the middle of the field. And I feel like if the Jets got like one guy who could play the middle of the field, it could be a safety, it could be a linebacker. Guy I have in mind is somebody like the way Jamal Adams used to be with the Jets. And of course, nobody's crying over that trade because Jamal Adams has not exactly been great in Seattle. And the Jets got 2 first-round picks, one of which turned into Garrett Wilson, one of which turned into Elijah Vera Tucker. Jets made out quite well in that trade, so I'm not saying that it was a bad trade. It was a good trade because Jamal Adams did not continue to play well after he left the Jets. But that type of player, I think that would be like the finishing touch on this defense. And I think the Jets will have some issues against teams with good receiving running backs and good receiving tight ends. Now, the positive to this, the spots I told you about in the first segment, defensive line and corner, those are the spots you really need to be good at in today's NFL. Because although the Jets will struggle against receiving tight ends and receiving running backs, there aren't many teams that make that a featured part of their offense. So if I have to be in a spot where that's problematic on defense, I think one would be linebacker, one would be safety. So I'm not worried about the defense per se, but these are the areas where I see that there are some concerns. Now, we're almost done talking about the Jets' positions, but as we close out this Thursday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast, I'm going to name you a couple of spots that I think are kind of up in the air, spots that are wild cards based on how certain young players perform. Their running back and their tight end. I'll explain why as we continue this Thursday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. I'm actually answering a mailbag question from our Wednesday mailbag call where somebody asked me to rate the positions on the Jets roster. Where do I feel good? Where do I not feel so good? And what positions do I view as wild cards? I'm going to close out the show by telling you 2 spots that I think are kind of wild cards for the Jets. One is the running back position. If you're a longtime listener, everydayer, you know that I love Breece Hall. You know that I loved the trade up last year for Breece Hall. You know how excited I was when the Jets got Breece Hall. You know how devastated I was when he got injured because he was dominating. Great, a home run hitter, a guy, tough back, big back who didn't show it as much last year, but will in the NFL be a tough inside runner. Last year was more of a home run hitter. He brings both. I think he brings the total package as a runner, but he's coming off a serious injury. And I do think there's a bit of a question of what he's going to provide this year. You've seen running backs suffer serious injuries similar to what Breece had, like a Saquon Barkley, who eventually got back to being great. But it took him some time. Even when he was healthy enough to play, he wasn't necessarily dominating right off the bat. It took him, a couple of years to get all the way back. I have no doubt Breece is going to get all the way back. The question is whether it'll be this year. And I think, especially in the early part of the season, Jets are going to want to be very cautious. I think they're going to want to be very deliberate with how they proceed with Breece, because I think you don't want to ask him to do too much too soon. You don't want to put too much strain on him as he comes back from that serious knee injury. I think you'll want to limit his touches because you'll want him down the stretch. As the weather turns cold, you want that guy you can just hand the ball to and know he'll be able to rip off 4 or 5 yards on any given play. And behind Brees, I think there are a lot of question marks. And folks who have been listening every day know that I like the 5th-round pick, Izzy Abanikanda. I think he's another guy who could be a home run hitter. He's not Brees Hall, nobody is. There's no other Brees out there. But Abanikanda is a guy who I think brings an extra gear. He's got speed. Now, there's some other spots that he was a little inconsistent. I think the one thing he brings to the table is that home run ability, that speed. I think everything else he's okay at. We'll see how he does as a rookie. I think he could be a contributor. But I think a lot of it comes down to Brees. And another wild card is Michael Carter, who had a good rookie season, a promising rookie year, and really did not follow it up at all. A guy who actually got benched during the season because he was just not productive. And after Brees went down, I was devastated, and I knew the Jets could not replace him, but I felt like Carter would leave them in a good place at running back, and he really struggled quite a bit. And then behind him, you have Bam Knight, who played like 3 good games and then 3 games where he didn't really do a whole lot. So there's a lot up in the air at the running back position, and part of it's just we don't know whether we're going to get the great Brees just yet. We will at some point. Will it be this year? And a lot of that's up to how he rehabs and how quickly he can get the D back to full strength. The other position that I think is a wild card is tight ends. Now, every dayers, you know how I feel about tight ends. You know how I feel about Conklin and Uzama. You know how I feel about the money that was spent to bring them in. And for those of you who are new to the show, I don't feel good about it at all. I don't think that they're particularly productive players. I don't think that the Jets were well advised to spend that money last year. I thought that the Jets' tight ends were just not very good last year. But there is some hope. And that hope is in the form of a second-year player out of Ohio State named Jeremy Ruckert, who the Jets drafted at the end of the 3rd round last year. And I liked that pick. And Ruckert's an interesting player because you kind of have to develop him both as a blocker and a receiver. I think as a blocker, he's very willing. You'll see him throw his body around. You already see some highlight reel blocks. Sometimes he's a little out of control, though. I think he's got to work on consistent technique. I think he's got to focus on making sure he's not. It's great to have aggression. And again, like I said with Joe Tippmann, aggression as a blocker makes up for a lot of sins. But I think sometimes he's a little too aggressive, and that causes his technique to go away, and he misses on some blocks sometimes. So they have to develop him that way. He also needed development as a receiver because, first of all, at Ohio State, did not run that big of a route tree. But beyond that, they had so many talented wide receivers in that program. That was Garrett Wilson was there, Chris Olave was there, Jackson Smith-Njigba was there, Jameson Williams was there. When you have that kind of talented wide receiver, the tight end's not going to get the ball very much. That's not to say anything bad about Jeremy Ruckert. That's just to say you have so much talented wide receiver. This is something similar to what Dawson Knox had at Mississippi, the Bills tight ends, where he had DK Metcalf and Elijah Moore. I'm sorry, not Elijah Moore, and A.J. Brown. Dawson Knox just did not have many opportunities. He came to the NFL and became a good tight end. And I think that's the hope for Jeremy Ruckert. He spent a year developing, hopefully developed his blocking technique a little bit, developed a little bit as a pass catcher, as a route runner. If he does that, I think there's a real opportunity for Ruckert to potentially earn a job and show he belongs and give the Jets some quality tight end play. Frankly, for the first time since Dustin Keller was here, I'm trying to think back to who the best Jets tight end has been in recent memory. It was Dustin Keller. After that, you have like the 1 year where Austin Seferian-Jenkins did a few things. You have that Ryan Griffin year where nobody covered him in the red zone. It's been a pretty dismal period for the Jets at the tight end position. And I think there's one guy who could end it. I think Ruckert's the wild card, and Ruckert could take this tight end position to the next level, which is actually decent tight end play. So hopefully Ruckert can do it. And some of the early signs from the offseason program are optimistic. So my hopes are with Ruckert because I don't have a lot of hopes for Conklin or Uzama. But Ruckert, I think this guy could end up being a decent player for the Jets. Anyway, I'd love to hear what you have to say. That's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on the podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review, or if you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help us out, help other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week.